So the history of the Witcher franchise and CD Projekt Red in general is kind of different from what you'd expect from a video game company.
Well, actually, it's very interesting to sort of look at that kind of stuff because if you actually look, there's a lot of really interesting backstories to a lot of game companies you just don't think about usually.
Yeah, and I'm guessing like this is kind of a more high-profile case because it pretty much, saved your entire country.
Well, yeah, obviously, this is sort of like the epitome of the interesting backstory of a video game company, but yeah, no, it's certainly something that's fun to look at if you actually.
So we should talk about the game itself a little bit. I've been playing Witcher 1 in preparation for Witcher 3. Not very much liking the combat system in it.
Really?
Yeah,
What is that?
I found it very repetitive myself.
But that doesn't take away from the fact that The Witcher 3 looks really awesome and I can't wait to play it.
The Poland of today is very different to the Poland of 30 years ago. Under the communist rule that had gripped the country since World War II, food was scarce and travel was a fantasy. But then, in the late 1980s, something miraculous happened. After a wave of revolution, Poland held its first democratic election. Almost overnight, Poles could travel beyond Eastern Europe, eat well, and a whole world of culture opened up before them, including video games. The new free market economy allowed many to start new businesses. Two such entrepreneurs, Marcin Owinski and Mikhail Kisinski, formed a new company called CD Projekt, or CD Projekt. The pair sold pirated games in Warsaw marketplaces, taking advantage of Poland's lack of copyright law. When these were eventually introduced, the pair focused on localizing and distributing Western games to small stores. They caught the attention of BioWare, who entrusted them with the PC port of Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, after CD Projekt sold 18,000 copies of the original game, a massive number at the time. Unfortunately, the primary developer, Interplay, went broke halfway through development. With a half-coded game and no IP to furnish it, CD Projekt began to look for an alternative license to complete their game. They approached Andrzej Sapkowski, who had found massive success with his Wiedźmin novels during the 1980s and 90s. Wiedźmin was first submitted as a short story to a science fiction and fantasy magazine. Roughly translated to The Hexer, the books chronicled the adventures of Geralt, a white-haired monster slayer. He adventured through the northern kingdoms of Edirne, Cadwin, Rivia, Redania and Temeria with his horse Roach and his lover Yennefer. CD Projekt chose the license for its modern, mature themes and desired to introduce the beloved lore to Western audiences. On a more personal level, the developers saw a lot of their own nation's history in the Hexer. The northern kingdoms are constantly beset by violence from neighbouring countries, much like Poland was for much of the 20th century. In 2002, CD Projekt Red was founded as a subsidiary of CD Projekt to facilitate the development of their first independent project. This, however, was not the first attempt at a Hexer game. A company called Metropolis, now defunct, worked on an adaptation of the books over 1996 and 97. With two other major games in development, Metropolis simply couldn't keep up, and the project was cancelled a few years later. Although there are similarities between this prototype and the series we know today, the main contribution from Metropolis was the name. With free reign over the English translation, Metropolis decided to call their game The Witcher. 11 years, 100 developers, and just over $5 million later, CD Projekt Red finally released The Witcher to the world. Rather than readapting the books, CD Projekt Red decided to instead build on the existing lore to tell their own original story. This is where I come in. I first saw The Witcher in a PC gaming magazine a year or so after it was released. I remember it looked so different at the time. Before Game of Thrones, dark, gritty fantasy was a real novelty. The game began near the winter stronghold of Kaer Morhen. Geralt wakes up in a nearby field, stripped of his memories, and is found and carried to the castle. Here we are introduced to the Witchers, genetically modified warriors who hunt monsters, brew potions, and never seem to sleep. These narrative considerations found their way into the gameplay. Players could collect ingredients along their journey, and use them to brew potions that would give them enhanced gameplay abilities. Geralt is also a master swordsman, which meant balancing strong, fast, and group fighting styles. Just like in the books, he carries both a steel and silver sword to combat humans and monsters respectively. Most combat encounters in the game required both careful planning and sharp reflexes, jumping between different fighting styles on the fly for each enemy. The combat mechanics were deceptively simple. The player simply clicked when prompted to instigate a combo. But because of the difficulty of the game, players had to carefully consider alchemy, swordplay, and magic to succeed. The game was set in and around the city of Vizima, capital of Temeria. Environment designs range from drab, muddy cities, to wide, golden fields, to calm lakes. Geralt met a series of important characters in his journey, including two old friends, the hardened dwarf Zoltan and Dandelion, the bard with a habit of getting in trouble. The game also introduced Triss Merigold, a sorceress with wide-ranging political influence. Two factions, the Scoia'tael and Order of the Flaming Rose, clashed throughout the narrative. Geralt eventually had to pick a side, using a moral choice system that relied on the player's political and personal ideologies, rather than a binary good and evil system. Lifting themes from the novels, The Witcher featured a unique take on a fantasy world. It subverted traditional fantasy tropes, and much like the graphic novel Watchmen, traced the impact of the mystical in an otherwise mundane setting. More grounded themes were present as well. Elves and dwarves were the victims of racial abuse and violence, and diplomacy played a large role in the narrative and dialogue. Geralt had to navigate the murky world of Viziman politics, trying to avoid offending the wrong person at the wrong time. He also met some highly influential characters, and at the end of his journey was personally rewarded by King Foltest himself. As Geralt turned his back, however, an assassination attempt takes place. With lightning reflexes, Geralt slays the would-be assassin and pulls down his mask, revealing the eyes of a Witcher. Despite a troubled development cycle, The Witcher was well received and has sold over 6 million copies to date. A year after launch, CD Projekt Red released an enhanced edition, which polished the original and added 2 short adventures. This attitude would establish a business model that persists to this day. Content patches and fixes for all of CD Projekt Red's games have been free since, and the company maintains a fierce anti-DRM policy. Fans, although grateful for the update, were keen to see where Geralt's adventures would take them next. After years of rumours and gameplay leaks, all was revealed in September of 2009, when CD Projekt Red announced The Witcher 2: Assassins of Kings. Abandoning the Aurora engine that powered the first game, the sequel instead utilised the all-new Red engine. The difference was immediately noticeable. Character models were more emotive, combat animations more varied and fluid, and the environments were full of detail and colour. The engine afforded a completely different game structure as well, with dramatically divergent paths through the game's main quest. Gameplay was also completely revamped. The developers replaced the rhythmic combat of the first game with a more natural system that emphasized light and heavy attacks, dodging, parrying, and magic. Small range weapons and traps were also thrown into the mix, and meditation was no longer restricted to fire pits. Finally, sections of the game enabled Geralt to sneak past enemies, or take them out in silence. The plot of The Witcher 2 picked up a few months after the first game. Geralt, now Foltest's personal guard, escorted the king through an assault on a rebel-held castle. Just when things seem to be going smoothly, a wild dragon appears out of nowhere, causing the group to desperately seek safety. In the chaos, the king is murdered by a mysterious witcher, and Geralt is arrested for the murder. After a detailed explanation, he is freed from prison by the leader of the king's special guard, Vernon Roche, and sets out to find and capture the real assassin. Along the way, he reunites with Triss, Zoltan, and Dandelion, and continues to uncover more of his memories. Geralt's quest takes him along the Pontar River, which borders the kingdoms of Temeria, Cadwin, and Edirn. He explores 3 key locations: the forested town of Flotsam, the dwarven city of Vergen, and the half-ruined Loch Muin. Environments were much more open than before, and featured plenty of interesting side quests. The art direction in particular was stunning, and really, there's nothing else like it. The Witcher 2 also featured great boss fights that required not only careful planning, but sharp concentration. The moral choices of the first game returned, forcing players to think on their feet and make decisions that affected the shape of the narrative from that point on, leading to 16 distinct endings. As well as its own self-contained plot, The Witcher 2 answered some long-held questions fans had had since the beginning of the trilogy. It was revealed that Geralt had lost his memories in the presence of the Wild Hunt, a group of extra-dimensional hunters. His lover, Yennefer, had been kidnapped by them shortly after Geralt had been killed and revived by his adopted daughter Ciri. He was slaughtered, protecting non-humans from an angry mob in the city of Rivia. Geralt managed to escape soon after catching up the Wild Hunt, collapsing in a field near Kaer Morhen, leading to the events of the first game. The Witcher 2 ends just as an army from the nearby nation of Nilfgaard begins to invade the northern kingdoms, and Geralt sets out to find Yennefer. The Witcher 2 was also met with high praise, and was re-released in an enhanced edition on the Xbox 360 a year later. It was available through both Steam and CD Projekt Red's other major contribution to the industry, goodoldgames.com. It's hard to overstate just how influential both the series and its developer have had on the Polish gaming industry. Where young Poles once saved up all their pocket money to buy a pirated floppy disk, they now aspire to work with one of the world's leading developers. For me, The Witcher 2 has always had a special place on my gaming shelf. With strong art direction, narrative design, and a respect for its lore, I can't help but admire the journey of both Geralt and CG Projekt Red. These games are dark, dense, and satisfying, and with The Witcher 3 on the horizon, it looks like things are only going to get better.
So that's it for this week's show. Let's have a look at what's coming on next week. Next week on Worldwide Gaming.